Hello, welcome to my first video. This is going to be covering my Dragonknight PVE build. It must be worth noted that, as you can see, I'm a relatively low CP player, and so my guides are designed to help those leveling up, as opposed to being a max CP guide itself. So a little precursor to talking about my tank guide. I think when you look at tanks, there's a few things that you can think about. Maybe you imagine your tank as being this super tanky, high resistance, high HP monster that cannot be downed. But for me, if you're the only one left at the fight and everyone else is dead, is that really helpful? And so I like to have a nice balance of self-survivability, but also group utility, which enables me to keep the group alive. With that in mind, let's delve in to the first part of the build, namely the skills. The first ability I like to use is Pierce Armour. And why is this good? Well, obviously you need a taunt, otherwise everyone's going to die and rage at you. But secondly, the resistance shred is really good for enabling you to allow the group to do more DPS. Second ability, Heroic Slash, is really nice in that it gives you minor maim, which reduces their damage done to you. And by they I mean the boss. Also, Minor Heroism is nice for granting ultimate, and really key for the build, which you'll sort of see later on. The third ability is a group heal buff, and there's a few options you can consider here. Resolving Vigour is really nice if you have lots of group melee DPS, so that you can heal them and help them stop dying from AoEs that they can't really avoid when they're trying to do their melee damage. Alternatively, you can slot Coagulating Blood, which is perhaps more selfish, but enables you to heal yourself really efficiently, as well as granting some good buffs, which increases your healing received. A really nice and clutch ability if things start to go down, especially in groups where you might pick up random players who don't quite know what they're doing. The fourth ability I like to use is Igneous Shield. And this is great because it kind of provides Resolving Vigour's utility with Coagulating Blood's good mitigation. A really nice ability. Also complements those two abilities I just talked about by providing you with Major Mending, which boosts your healing. The fifth ability that I like to use is Absorb Magic. And it's not really because of the first part of the ability, because that's not too reliable in my experience, but the amount of damage you can block being increased by 8% is good, and the cost of blocking reduced by 8% is really nice. By reducing the cost of your block, it means you have more stamina for things like rolling out of dangerous abilities, as well as also enabling you to use other abilities like Resolving Vigour more frequently. Now, the ultimate I use in this bar is Aggressive Horn, and it really is a staple of tanking, I think. Not only does it provide group survivability with the increased health, but also increase their DPS. Especially on endgame builds for DPS where they have high crit chance, the Major Force buff is really useful for them. On my off bar, I like to use a Magicka ranged taunt. It's worth noting that this ability perhaps should not be morphed, because some would say that the extra % chance on the morph is not helpful, as this can interfere with other helpful synergies. The second ability I use is Chains. Unrelenting Grip allows us to pull in trash pack mobs to stack them up in conjunction with choking Talons so that we can easily kill the mobs and increase the clear time on dungeons we do. Now, choking Talons is not only good for what I said before, but also because it inflicts enemies with minor maim so that their damage is reduced. Now, you'll often find as a tank, especially if you're learning, that you might feel overwhelmed by the amount of mobs that are incoming, and you feel like you can't taunt them all in time before they start damaging your group. This helps the matter, and if I'm being honest, I only really taunt the mobs that are particularly dangerous, such as ones which do really high damage heavy attacks. Sometimes it's just not feasible to taunt every single mob, so that's a really nice ability to help mitigate for that. The fourth ability I use is Shuffle, and Major Evasion is a really strong buff. Consequently, it can help save you from damaging abilities through dodging. It's also really instrumental to the sets we use later on, which we'll find out. Volatile Armour is kind of a self-explanatory one. It gives us our resistances that we need as a tank to survive, and it also allows us to have an AoE aggro mechanic. By running into mobs that are not taunted yet, you can pop this and they'll all start attacking you first. Really good. The other option is the morph that gives you a damage shield, though I find the shield is very low and doesn't last long enough to be viable in my opinion, though I think some people certainly have made it work. Finally, Magma Shell. Now, in terms of group utility, it's really nice in that it provides a damage shield, which is quite significant to nearby allies. However, I find the main purpose for this is it helps lower CP players complete content. For me, at least, I've had to do a lot of random queues, and I've ended up with all types of groups, some really good and some less than optimal. Effectively, this is useful. If your whole group dies, you can pop this, and assuming there's not too many stun mechanics, or if you pop it right after a CC break, you can res your healer and maybe even res everyone else after that, and consequently clear the content. As I said, with Veteran Cradle of Shadows on the last boss, this happened to me. I managed to res the healer by using this, and we then cleared the content. So I can't recommend it enough, to be honest. It's a really solid ability. It's worth noting as well, in endgame content, some tanks that I've talked to say that it's really efficient, and really maybe even essential to complete some of the content they tank. So that's the skills we've talked about. Now, before getting into the set discussion, let's just talk about a little bit of support information with regard to the build. So, with regards to potions, there's a few options. If you're poor, like me sometimes, or at least when I first started out, you can use Magicka pots or Stamina pots, depending on what you need. And these drop from dungeons, they're really cheap, and it's really quite an efficient way of getting stats back. If you do have the money, Tripots are really, really good, because not only do they provide the intellect endurance buffs for longer, but they also restore more, or restore each one, each stat. So, that's what I'd recommend. Also, with respect to food, I use Tri-Food. It lasts quite a long time, which is a benefit for people with short on cash. It's really nice to be able to have food that lasts a long time. It also provides each stat, which is really nice for a tank, because often we use or utilize every single one. With respect to support skills, with that in mind, it is really nice to get medicinal use, which increases the buff uptime from these pots by 30%. But don't worry too much about this, it can be kind of expensive to level that up from scratch, so just work on it slowly if you don't have much money. With respect to attributes, this is a stat line I currently use. I would recommend trying to get close to this, if possible. It works well for me, and obviously my attributes are geared towards getting that. Now if you're a different racial from me, you might have a different stat allocation, because your percentages might be a bit different. So just edit it to your taste and perhaps get roughly around the same level as I do. One of the other considerations is, as you've seen, or at least you will now see, the cost of these abilities are quite expensive, at least with Magicka, and I like to use Igneous Shield quite a lot because it's a really solid ability. So how do we manage to do this with a relatively low Magicka pool? It's mainly in the Magicka recovery, and as you can see it sits quite high. And this is unbuffed. If we're going to pop a pot, you can quickly see that it sits at 1500, which I think is really solid. And this enables us to pump out a lot of group utility. We mainly achieve this through the Vampire side of the build alongside the Atronach Mundus Stone. Now with respect to Vampire, there's a few things we're going to want to consider first. If I can get there and not be a clumsy fool. Alright, so Stage 2 Vampirism gives us 10% Magicka and Stamina recovery, which is really quite nice. Obviously the Stamina recovery doesn't benefit us too much because when we're blocking it gets set to 0, but every little helps. This is where the option then comes in for you if you're doing Vampire tanking. You can decide to stay at Stage 2 and just get this buff, or you can decide to go Stage 3 and also get the Undeath buff, which reduces the damage you take as your health gets lower. I have been testing this, and it's worth noting that often healers like to keep you topped up, so you don't notice too much. But in some fights, where damage is incoming quite frequently and the healer can't keep up, this can help a lot, because it synergizes quite nicely with Coagulating Blood. Because as the tooltip says in Coagulating Blood, as your HP gets lower, well, or I should say, perhaps better to say it like this, you heal for 40% of your missing health. So the lower your health, the more you heal for. So really nice synergy there. Also, if you didn't know already, having Vampire does increase your flame damage. You take 20% more damage from fire, and your health regen also gets sacrificed quite a bit. As a Dunmer, I do have mitigation to this from my passive, which gives me flame resist. So perhaps, as a non-Dunmer tank, you might want to consider just doing Stage 2, because as I said, the Stage 3 benefit is perhaps not too significant. Having talked about those precursors, let's then have a look at the skills, the sets themselves. So the first set I like to use is Tava's Bloodspawn Guise. This is particularly good because it provides us with some good ulti regeneration, which then allows us for more Warhorns. As I slipped up before, yeah, Tava's Favour as well does a similar thing. So really nice sets. 5-piece of that and 2-piece Bloodspawn. Now the resistances as well on Bloodspawn do look nice, but it's worth keeping in mind that you shouldn't rely too heavily on this, because unless you're doing a heavy ad fight, lots of NPCs attacking you at once, it's not going to proc too often to give you high tankiness in that sense. You also see that I run 1 light, 1 medium, and then 5 heavy. This is primarily because of the passive from the Undaunted skill line, which gives us 6% extra stats. If you don't have max Undaunted, I would recommend perhaps 7 heavy, just to make you a little bit more tanky. Though it's worth mentioning that, especially with the shoulder, as some of you probably know, the RNG involved in getting a nice shoulder can be quite difficult. So really just go with what you like, or not like, but what you have. So, with that covered then, let's talk about the traits of these armor pieces. I think Sturdy is one of the better options. Certainly for my playstyle, I like it a lot. I used to run a different setup, which is infused on the large pieces of my armor, like at the head, but the Sturdy really provides block reduction, which allows for your stamina pool to remain really high. And then it means you can actually roll a lot more, it means you're less stressed and you worry less about having to keep your stamina up. Really good. I'd recommend it on all 7 of your armor, though as I said, if you have bad RNG on your Bloodspawn, then feel free to use whatever. The third set I use is Ebon, and on looking at it, it provides some nice HP buffs, a little healing taken, and then the 5th piece is what you really want it for. And you might be thinking this is a relatively minor buff. I mean, look at our HP. Is 1k really a deal breaker? It doesn't seem so, but the real power of this build, so to speak, lies in the fact that it can help our allies out. For example, a maxed out CP player who does DPS is probably not going to have any points in HP whatsoever. Consequently, his health is going to sit around about 17k roughly. It will vary depending on ratio and whatnot. But this allows us to get him to about 18k, 18.5k with the Ebon set. And I think that's really powerful. It can really make the difference between a dead DPS and one that barely survives, and for the healer, it makes a big difference. Now, I haven't talked too much about the enchants I use in the armor, and this is primarily because it really depends on how you're sitting in stats. And you really just want to optimize it, try and get to a similar stat line as me. You could lower your Magicka to about 15k if you liked, certainly, but I just have it a little bit higher at the moment. With respect to how you enchant it, I would recommend putting single type enchants on your large pieces, so your head, your chest, your legs, and your shield. And on your smaller pieces, I'd recommend using a tri-enchant. However, it is worth noting if you're low on cash, you probably shouldn't do this because it's a lot of money and you have better things in life to do than spend 10k per enchant. It's not a lot of money. But if that's the case, then just use single type enchants once again and just try and allocate your stats in a similar manner as myself. Moving on to the enchants on our jewellery, I like to use 1 Magicka recovery. In a similar manner as what we talked about before, is to just boost this even further. Then I use 2 shield play, and it's really nice for 2 reasons. First of all, as a tank, it's really important to interrupt or bash, as it says here, enemy channel abilities, because these can sometimes wipe the group. So really nice. Also, the reduced cost of blocking further helps our sturdy, and it means that our stamina pool from blocking is not really being affected. Moving on to our weapon choice. So, our swords. As you can see, one of them is defending and one is infused. And you might be thinking that infused is a weird choice, because it really sacrifices the amount of resistances we have. Because already, as you see, buffed up, we sit at 29k and 25k, but that's really not too high compared to some tanks. So why is it? Well, it goes back to the utility principle. I find that I don't need that high resistances to stay alive. So, in turn, I like to use this ability, which allows us to maximize group DPS by further shredding the boss's resistances. Really useful, and I really quite like it. Why then would I use defending on my other bar? Well, as you see, when we're blocking, as we bar swap, the block goes down. And since our ability buffs are on our off bar, we're going to have to swap bars every 20 seconds or so to keep the abilities up. So, defending is quite nice because if you are inexperienced or just don't really notice it, or perhaps if you lag because you have shitty Australian ping like myself, 400 ping-ish most of the time, then you're going to want to have some kind of fallback mechanism to sort of save you, and this can help. If you get hit by a heavy attack while bar swapping, the extra resistances that kick in can really mitigate the damage, which is really good. So I'd recommend that. With regards to the enchant, really optional. Stamina, restore magicka, all viable. Other options, do whatever you like really, in that respect, it's not too crucial. The return on the stamina is quite minor. With respect to the trait on the shields, I am using reinforced, only because, as you see later, the CP points provide a nice incentive for doing so. However, sturdy might actually be a better choice. One thing I will talk about before getting into CP points is that as I've touched on before, there is the importance of keeping up your buffs. So, applying them, as you see, the uptime there, beside my stats, lasts for about 20 seconds. And once that's over, you want to then bar swap and reapply. Similarly, with your Pierce Armour and Heroic Slash, you want to keep these up on the boss to ensure ulti-gen and resistant shred. Now, in some gameplay I will show you, you will notice that I do actually swap and reapply before the timers are off. And this is, I guess, in some ways inefficient. But from my perspective, I do have bad ping in some ways, and also, I think it's really good when you're learning to try and focus on keeping it up, but perhaps be a little bit resource inefficient, rather than have downtime on your buffs. Why is this? Well, primarily because our build has such good resource regeneration that really you're not going to suffer from reapplying your buffs too much. So having covered that, let's briefly talk about the CP points. And obviously this isn't too much theory crafting gone into this. I'm not max CP and I haven't thought about the most efficient way, but this is what I've sort of observed from playing and leveling up as to what's really good. So this is kind of like the defensive tree, so to speak, and you have a few options. You can go with perhaps extra healing received, extra resistances like spell shield, but I find that in general, at least with spell shield and the armor one as well, this isn't too efficient. At least at low CP. I think the best way to go about it is to increase your elemental defender and hardy traits to really ensure that the amount of damage you're taking is reduced. Now naturally as a vampire, and also you've seen before, buffed up, we're sitting at about 25k and 29k. You might want to put more points into physical resist. And certainly, I perhaps should have done so for the sake of the build video, but the point being here is as to why mine's even is because certain fights require different CP allocations. In a general case, perhaps if you don't want to waste 3,000 gold each time you want to change this, then you can certainly keep it with a more into hardy than into elemental defender. If you're not Dunmer in a vampire tank, then perhaps you might want to do the opposite and allocate a bit more into elemental to mitigate the extra flame damage you're taking. It's worth noting also that the reason I run reinforced is because of this passive, which increases the armor of our shields by 75%, really nice. Let's move on to the blue side of things. I put most points into Blessed, which increases the effectiveness of healing done. This really works well with Vigour and Dragon Blood. Allows for some insane healing to come out of a tank. I also put 30 points into Melee Weapon Expert, and this is just to get riposte, and honestly, not the best of abilities. You would probably be much better suited putting these into other areas, such as more into Blessed. The only reason I do this is because, well, it's fun. And perhaps if you get into a random group that does like 1k DPS, you can beat them on the DPS charts. That's something you want to do. Jokes aside though, not that great, so it's really up to you where you want to put those points. Moving on to the kind of regen and cost reduction side of the tree, I put a lot into Arcanist just to boost up the magical recovery even more, and also put points into Warlord. Now it's worth noting that with more CP, I'd probably have a balance in Magician as well as having more Arcanist. It's really just a matter of allocating your CP smart, and I think this Warlord decision is probably preference rather than being actually the best case, and really depends on which way you want to go. So, having talked about that, that's pretty much all about the build. Naturally, if you have any questions, feel free to put it down. I may have missed a few things. If that's the case, apologies. But I'm going to have a bit of gameplay now, and I'm going to commentate. So thanks for the 1 or 2 people that are still here for listening. And hopefully you'll tune in for more videos in the future. Bye. Alright, so here we have just a fight on the Planar Inhibitor and Veteran White Gold Tower. Just want to showcase that the build can still tank quite well, even as a Vampire DK. As you'll notice throughout the fight, I will reapply buffs before they've expired, but that's really just a matter of wanting to be safe and ensure the uptime is kept at 100% as much as possible. You'll also notice how Igneous Shield is used quite a lot, and it's also helping our group keep their HP nice and topped up. So once again, the pinion's been on me the whole time, so the dot's quite high, and now the boss is going into blue phase, so I back out as to not die. And as you'll see, I pop Magma Shell to stop the incoming damage, really efficient. And then when that duration ends, as you'll see, I'll get some really nice Coagulating Bloods in, which heal me up by about 15k. So right about now, or Coagulating, and there you see it's a really nice heal. And even as a Vampire I've been able to tank that pretty well. The build is certainly strong. That's about it guys, and I'll leave you with the gameplay.